and I'll just touch on that point because it's interesting because the World Health Organisation actually recommended that anyone that was diagnosed with COVID from a PCR test should be coded to U07.1, which is usually reserved for a laboratory confirmation. Do you think it was unorthodox for the World Health Organisation to change the rules for COVID whereby people were being coded as a COVID death when the laboratory hadn't actually confirmed whether or not it was a COVID death? They were just relying on a PCR test. That, as yet, the TGA refused to give me the actual primers to indicate whether or not the COVID tests, how the COVID tests were actually determined.
So, Professor Kelly might have some views on this, but the ABS go through their own coding process. So when they assign a cause of death, they independently go through clinical records. If there's been a coroner's report, they'll go through that as well.
That's what I'm saying. The clinical records were changed by the World Health. The procedures for following clinical records were changed by the World Health Organisation for COVID to say that someone died as per a laboratory determination, i.e. an autopsy, but they're actually only relying on a PCR test, which has a much larger margin of error.
So Professor Kelly might have further comments. I'm not sure.
So I'll lead the TGA to their own to talk about PCR. But Senator, I think there's a number of streams to your question here, if you allow me to kind of consider. So firstly, on the excess death element, you're correct that in 2021 there was excess deaths, particularly in relation to 2020, and there's a range of reasons why that's the case, even in the places that, as you said, there was no COVID. So there was a change in behaviour right across Australia in terms of 2020. People were going out less. There was no flu during that year at all, pretty much. In some places that returned in later years, and so we are looking into that in some detail. But just to say that that's related to vaccination, as you've said, we should be looking more closely at that, and we have. And the study that you talked about earlier, that's now been published, does that. It actually very specifically looks who has been vaccinated using exact numbers from the Australian Immunisation Register and looking at matching that with ABS-related death numbers. That is not just PCR. ABS relies on a doctor writing a death certificate, which will take into account a range of matters. So that's the best data we have, and the best data we have shows that there is no evidence of an increase in death related to vaccination from all causes. And if you look at vaccination in relation to over 65s from COVID, they are 88% protected. And that's from the same study in early 22.
Well, it's interesting because in regards to your Freedom of Information report that was from the actual health.gov.au, it actually says there's similar severe disease risk factors in vaccinated versus unvaccinated individuals. So it contradicts your own memos between your own organisations, I should add. But the question I wanted to get to was that given that deaths decreased in 2020 as a result of lockdowns in 2020, and in 2021 both New South Wales and Victoria had extended lockdowns. New South Wales, being the largest state, had a 3-month lockdown period. You would have expected to see a decrease in deaths, not an increase in deaths. So if anything, deaths should have decreased in 2021 as a result of the extended lockdowns in New South Wales in particular, and they didn't. It still increased.
Yeah. So, Senator Rennick, you need to pose that as a question. This isn't an opportunity to just present information.
Why are you not taking that into account when you're, refusing to take, consider vaccines as the reason? You still haven't given me a reason why these figures increased, notwithstanding the fact that there were more lockdowns in 2021 than 2020.
So the ABS figures, as you've quoted there, look at a range of matters that are related to the death certificates that I talked about. They don't look specifically at individuals or specific risk factors other than what is related in the death certificate. So we have other sources of data which we've looked at, and I come back to the best way of looking at vaccination and death. There are two ways, I would say. One I've already discussed in terms of the NCS paper. The other is the extensive work that is done in relation to vaccine adverse event reporting through the TGA, and I'll leave the TGA to talk about that and the outcome.
Authorised G. Rennick, LNP Chermside.